Chapter 3 of Crime as Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 3 Influence of Race. Virtuous Savages. Criminal Centers. Semitic Race. Greeks in Italy and in France. Cephalic Index. Color of Hair. Jews. Gypsies. Subchapter 16 Influence of Race. We have already seen, and it will become clearer as we proceed, that the notion of crime existing in the mind of the savage is so vague that we often let it doubt its existence in the primitive man altogether. However, many tribes seem to have a relative morality of their own, which they apply in their own fashion, and immediately we see crime arise among them. Among the Audiories in America, the respect for property is so great that a threat is sufficient for a boundary line. The Kodiaks and the Mabayas punish homicide committed within the tribe, although they do not regard it as a crime when committed against outsiders. It is plain that without some such law, the tribe could not hold together, but would soon disintegrate. There are, however, tribes to whom even this relative morality is repugnant. So in Karamansa, in Africa, alongside of the honest and peaceful Bagnas, who practice rice culture, we find the Balants, who live by hunting and robbery alone. These put to death any who steal in their own village, but nevertheless steal from other tribes themselves. The one who steals best is most esteemed among them, and is even paid to teach their children to steal, as well as chosen to lead their marauding expeditions. Not unlike these are the Beni Hassan of Morocco, whose chief business is theft. These are disciplined, live under their own chiefs, with rights recognized by the government, which makes use of their services in the recovery of stolen goods. They are divided into oat thieves, horse thieves, village thieves, and highwaymen. There are among them mounted robbers, who flee so quickly that pursuit is futile. They often slip into houses, naked, and covered with oil, or hide themselves under leaves in order not to frighten the horses. They begin to steal at the age of 8. In India there exists the tribe of the Zakakal, who live by theft. When a boy is born to them, they dedicate him to his future profession by passing him through a hole broken into a house wall, and saying to him 3 times, "Be a thief." The Kurubars, on the other hand, are noted for their honesty. They never lie, and would rather starve than steal. They are therefore said to keep watch over the harvest. Spencer also notes certain peoples as inclined to honesty, such as the Todas, the Ainus, and the Bodos. These are in general peoples among whom war is held in slight esteem, and who are much engaged in trade. As a rule, they do not contend among themselves, but leave their affairs to be regulated by the chiefs, and restore half of what is offered to them in their bartering if it appears to them to be too much. They do not apply the lex talionis, are not guilty of cruelty, honour women, and nevertheless, strange to say, are not religious. Among the Arabs, Bedouins, there are honest and industrious tribes, but there are also many others who would lead a parasitic life. These are noted for their spirit of adventure, their reckless courage, their need for continual change, their idleness, and their tendency toward theft. In Central Africa, Stanley found some tribes distinguished for honesty, and others, like the Zayas, showed a tendency towards robbery and homicide. Among the Kafirs and Hottentots, there are individuals who are especially savage and incapable of working, and what about living by the labour of others. These are called fingers by the Kafirs, and Sonquas by the Hottentots. Mayhew. In our civilized world, to note the proof of the influence of race upon crime is both easier and more certain. We know that a large number of the thieves of London are of Irish parentage, and are natives of Lancashire. In Russia, according to Anochin, Bessarabia, and Kherson furnish all the thieves of the capital, and the number of convictions in proportion to the number of indictments in their case is unusually great. Criminality is transmitted among them from family to family. In Germany, the districts in which there are colonies of gypsies are recognized as those where the women are most inclined to steal. Subchapter 17 Criminal Centers. In every part of Italy, almost in every province, there exists some village renowned for having furnished an unbroken series of special delinquents. Thus in Liguria, Lirius is proverbial for swindlers, Campofreddo and Masson for homicides, Pozzolo for highway robberies. In the province of Lucca, Caparoni is noted for its assassinations, and Carre in Piedmont for its field thefts. In southern Italy, Soro, Melfi, and St. Fel have always had their banners since 1860, and the same is true of Partinico and Monreale in Sicily. This predominance of crime in certain countries is certainly due to race, as history clearly shows in the case of some of them. Thus, Pergola, near Pistoia, was settled by Gypsies, Masson by Portuguese outlaws, and Caporfetto by Corsican pirates. Even today, the dialect of the latter part is half Corsican, half Ligurian. But the most famous of all is the village of Artena in the province of Rome, which Signel describes thus. Situated on the summit of a hill in the middle of a green and smiling plain, under a mild sky, this village, where misery is unknown, ought to be one of the happiest and most honest. But the reverse is the case, as inhabitants have an evil celebrity throughout all the surrounding country as thieves, brigands, and assassins. This reputation is not a recent acquisition. In the Italian chronicles, one often meets the name of Artina, and its history can be summed up as one long series of crimes. The seriousness of the evil may be seen from the following statistical table. A table is displayed on the page, annual numbers of crimes to 100,000 inhabitants, with 3 columns, with crimes listed as homicides, murders, robberies, followed by homicide, assaults, highway robberies, thefts simple and aggravated, and divided again between Italy in 1875 to 88 and Artina in 1852 to 88. Artina then is marked by a number of assaults, homicides, and murders 6 times as great as that of the average of Italy, and by a number of highway robberies 30 times as great. Yet these figures give only a very imperfect idea of the boldness and ferocity of the criminals of Artina. To have this properly appreciated, it would be necessary to describe all the crimes, to tell how they commit murders there in broad daylight in public place, how they strangle the witnesses who dare to tell the truth to the judges. The case, according to Siegel, lies in the character of the inhabitants and the influence of earlier governments, which elsewhere gave rise to brigandage and the Camorra. Further, in the inability of the authorities to punish the guilty because the witnesses are bribed or intimidated into keeping silent, but above all, in the influence of hereditary. In fact, in an investigation of the proceedings instituted against the inhabitants of Artina since 1852, Siegel came across the same names repeatedly. Father, son, and nephew followed one another at intervals as if driven by a fatal necessity. The name Montefortino, belonging to an ancient family of Artina, was already celebrated for crime as early as 1555. Paul IV in 1557 was obliged to condemn to death all the inhabitants of this town, and authorized anyone to kill them and destroy their castle, that it might no longer furnish a nest and refuge for base thieves. It is to be noted that in Sicily, brigandage is almost exclusively confined to that famous valley of the Conca d'Oro, where the robber tribes of Berbers and Semites had their first and most lasting places of refuge, and where the anatomical type, the customs, the political and moral ideals still retain the Arabian imprint, as the descriptions of Tomasi Crudels are sufficient to prove. Moreover here, as among the Arabs, cattle stealing is the chief crime. With these facts we can easily be persuaded that the blood of this people at once conquers and robbers. Hospitable and cruel, intelligent and superstitious, inconstant, restless, and impatient of restraint, must have its influence in Sicily in fomenting the sudden and implacable revolts and perpetuating brigandage. This latter, it is to be noted, is often mixed with politics, as it is in the case of the parent Arabian stock, and excites neither the horror nor the aversion displayed by peoples less intelligent, indeed, but richer in Aryan blood, such as those of Catania and Messina in the same island of Sicily. A very different sort of community is that of the Larderello in the province of Volterra, where for 60 years no homicide or theft or even misdemeanor has been committed. That race is a factor in the greater criminality of the places mentioned. I am the more persuaded, though having observed, in the case of most of the inhabitants, a taller stature than in the neighbouring regions. In France, also, a race of criminals has been discovered by Fauvel in a row of villages along the border of the forest of Tyrec, a continuation of the forest of Ardines. In every place where this race predominates, there are continually violent brawls, to which the authorities must often have to shut their eyes. The stranger who ventures among these people exposes himself to the insults of the women as of the men. Even among the well-to-do, the same brutality often shows itself through a certain political varnish. This half-barbarous condition is aggravated by a frequent alcoholism, and the people, scorning agricultural pursuits, betake themselves to work in the forests or in the ironworks. Their real preference, however, is smuggling. They are a little below the average in height, but have powerful muscles with broad, strong jaws, straight nose, pronounced eyebrows, and thick dark hair. This last characteristic separates them at once from the blonde-haired race who inhabit the villages near them, with whom they associate only rarely. Subchapter 18. Europe. In his Homicide, Ferry shows clearly the influence of race upon the distribution of crime in Europe, Latin and Teuton occupying the opposite extremes of the scale, both for homicide in general and also for aggravated homicide and infanticide. The same is true with regard to suicide and insanity, except that here the order is reversed, and the Teuton shows a maximum in each case, and the Latin the minimum. Subchapter 19. Austria. Very often, however, it is not possible to arrive at an exact estimate of the influence of race from the figures furnished by criminal statistics, for we encounter a whole complexus of causes which prevents us from drawing a definite conclusion. For example, women show the minimum degree of criminality in Spain, Lombardy, Denmark, Slavonia, and Goritz, and the maximum in Austria, Silesia, and the Baltic provinces of Russia. But here the cultural influence is more in evidence than the racial, for with women as educated like the men, as in Silesia and the Baltic provinces, or where they take part with the men in the struggle for existence, they approach men more nearly in the degree of criminality. The same thing may be said of the greater criminality to be observed in the Austrian Empire, chiefly among the youths, especially in Salzburg and Austria proper, as compared with the Slavs and Italians of Goritz, Carinthia, and the Tyrol. Subchapter 20. Italy. The following table presents a summary of simple homicides, including assaults followed by death, and aggravated homicides, including highway robbery with homicide, for which indictments were brought in the different provinces of Italy in the years 1880 to 83, inclusive. A table is displayed on the page with two columns: province of Italy with the population in 1881, and the number of indictments for homicide to the million inhabitants, split between simple and aggravated. It is apparent, then, that these crimes are most frequent in the provinces where the population is predominantly Semitic. Sicily, Sardinia, Calabria were purely Latin, Latium, Abruzzo, as compared with those where the population is Teutonic, Ligurian, Celtic, Lombardy, Liguria, Piedmont, or Slavic, Venetia. Now, beside the original inhabitants, the Ligurians in the north, the Umbrians and Etruscans in the centre, the Oscans in the south, and the Siculi, of Ligurian origin, in Sicily. The principal social elements of the Italian population are the Teutons, Celts and Slavs in the north, and the Phoenicians, Arabs, Albanians and Greeks in the south and on the islands. It is then to the African and Oriental elements, the Greek expected, that Italy owes a frequency of homicide to Calabria, Sicily and Sardinia, where the occurrence of a similar number, as in Lombardy, is due to the large Teutonic element in the population. The effect of race is clear to be seen in certain localities, whose inhabitants differ ethnically from the surrounding population, and where the relative frequency or infrequency of crime coincides with a racial difference. Thus we have a striking contrast in Tuscany, where Siena shows 39 homicides to the million, Florence 43 and Pisa 60, while Massa Carrara shows 83, Grosseto 102, Lucca 119, Arezzo 134, and Leghorn 140. Now it is true that in Massa Carrara the quarries, and in Grosseto the marshes, produce special living conditions, but the ethnic influence is incontestable with the province of Lucca, which is differentiated from the rest of Tuscany by the greater stature and dilocephaly of its inhabitants, the latter characteristic being found in Massa Carrara also, and the greater tendency to immigration. One may refer also to the effect of Ligurian blood, calling to mind how often the ancient Ligurians revolted against the Roman rule. But in Leghorn the racial influence is especially evident, and the origin of this is well known. Leghorn in the 16th century was merely a marshy village, having 749 inhabitants in 1551. Its first settlers were the Liburni, an Illyrian people, inventors of the Liburian galley, and notorious pirates. To these were added Saracens, Jews, and Marseillais, and later adventurers and pirates invited by the Medici. Lecourt, from which 1879 to 1883 showed the greatest proportion of indictments of crime, furnished likewise, in comparison with the whole of Tuscany, including Arezzo, the highest numbers of aggravated homicide, rebellion, and aggravated theft. The state of affairs cannot be accounted for by the greater density of the population, for the density of Milan is the same, 919 to the square mile, and that in Naples is much greater, 3,976. Neither is it due to a greater preponderance of the urban population, for the urban residents in Naples constitute 94% of the total population of the municipality, in Milan 92%, and in Leghorn only 80%, while nevertheless insurrections and aggravated thefts are much more frequent there. Another very significant contrast is to be observed in the southern part of the peninsula. Here the summary of simple homicides shows certain localities in the provinces of Campobasso, Avellino, Cosenza, and Catanzaro, with a relatively high criminality, and localities in the provinces of Benevento, Salerno, Bari, and Lucca, where the frequency of homicide is small in comparison with the neighbouring provinces of Aquila, Caserta, Potenza, Reggio, and especially Naples. In the last, the social environment would naturally be expected to be provocative of crime. Now it is difficult not to deduce a casual connection between the presence of Albanian colonies and the great number of crimes of violence in the provinces of Cosenza, Catanzaro, and Campobasso. On the other hand, the less frequent occurrence of simple homicide in Reggio, Naples, and especially in Apulia, Bari, and Lecce, depends in great part upon the Greek element of the population. To understand the presence and extent of this element, it is only necessary to recall the ancient Magna Graecia, the latter Greek colonies which arrived during and after the Byzantine supremacy, and the early migrations of the Oipagon Messapians. Even today, says Nicolucci, the physiognomy of the greater part of the natives of these provinces recalls this type, through which shines pacific sweetness of character. To the effect of the Greek element must be added the ethnic influence of the Norman occupation. As regards marked infrequency of simple homicide in Salerno and in Benevento, it is impossible not to recall the Lombard element, which was dominant in the Duchy of Benevento and Salerno so long and to such an extent that it has been able to resist the assimilating power of the native Italians, and to preserve to this day the tall stature and blonde hair, noticeable in the midst of the type indigenous to the peninsula, Ferri. The quite indifferent influence of the Albanian, Greek, and Lombard elements upon the criminality in these contrasted localities is confirmed by the distribution of aggravated homicide and highway robbery with homicide. Salerno and Reggio, indeed, form exceptions having relatively high figures, but Naples, thanks to its Greek blood, shows, notwithstanding the density and poverty of its population, a small number of homicides matching the figures for Bari and Lecce. Sicily, also, offers a striking example of the influence of race upon homicide. The eastern provinces, Messina, Catania, and Syracuse, show a number of homicides much smaller than the provinces of Caltanissetta, Girgenti, Trapani, and Palermo. Now Sicily differs greatly in the character of its population from the neighbouring part of the peninsula, partially because of the numerous northern peoples, Vandals, Normans, French, which have conquered and ruled the island. But on the eastern coast it is the Greek element that is predominant, and it is impossible not to refer to this fact the smaller number of homicides occurring there, nor, on the other hand, to see in the large admixture of Saracen and Albanian blood the reason for great frequency of homicides in the south and north. Reclus writes, at the time of the siege of Palermo by the Normans, 1071 AD, there were 5 languages spoken in Sicily: Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and the popular Sicilian. Arabic remained the dominant language even under the Normans. Later the French, the Germans, the Spaniards, and the Aragonese contributed to make of the Sicilians a people different from their Italian neighbours in dress, manners, customs, and national feeling. The differences existing within the Sicilian population itself are very great, since now one race, now another, gets the upper hand in the mixture. Thus the people of the Etna provinces, who are without doubt of Hellenic origin, being in fact the purest of the Greeks, since they have not been mixed with the Slavs, have an excellent reputation for deportment and amiability. The inhabitants of Palermo, on the contrary, among whom the Arab element is greater than anywhere else, have in general serious faces and dissolute manners. The criminality of Sardinia is equally characteristic, whether one compares it with that of the continent, and even with that of Sicily, or considers the almost constant contrast between the north province of Cesare and the south province of Cagliari. Ethnically, Sardinia is differentiated from Sicily because the Phoenician domination, begun in remote antiquity and renewed in Carthaginian times, was both more extensive and of longer duration in Sardinia than in Sicily, so that even today the Sardinian skull may possibly serve to illustrate the ancient Phoenician Cephalic type. The Saracen elements in Sardinia are less significant, though there are 2 Saracen colonies, Barbaracini in the province of Cesare and Moredi near Iglesias in the province of Cagliari. This racial difference certainly contributes to reduce the higher average of crimes against persons in Sicily, notwithstanding the relatively small number in the eastern provinces, and on the other hand, the higher average of crimes against property in Sardinia. For example, in comparing Sardinia with Sicily, one sees a striking contrast in the number of simple homicides, which comes out still more strongly in the number of assaults. In the case of aggravated homicides, indeed, the figures for Sicily are lower on account of the small number in the eastern provinces. But the total of all crimes against persons, including homicide, simple and aggravated, and highway robbery accompanied by homicide, is much greater than in Sardinia. In crimes against property, on the contrary, Sardinia, on account of the preponderance of Semitic blood, goes far beyond Sicily, especially in aggravated thefts and in forgeries, whereas in violent crimes against property, such as highway robbery, extortion, and blackmail, Sicily again takes the lead somewhat. In Sardinia, moreover, a contrast is to be observed between the 2 provinces of Cesare and Cagliari in the very type of the inhabitants and in their social and economic life. The north has agriculture and manufacturing more developed, while the south has mines near Cagliari, Iglesias, etc. Now it is well known that the province of Cagliari is more decidedly Phoenician, whereas in the province of Cesare the Spanish element dominates, and this fact doubtless cooperates with the economic conditions to cause a greater frequency of forgery and aggravated theft in the province of Cagliari, and of homicide and highway robbery with homicide in the province of Cesare. Another example of the influence of race is found in the Criminality of Corsica, which notoriously gives the maximum number of homicides, infanticide and poisoning excepted, for the whole of France, but shows a very small number of thefts. By comparing the number of persons sentenced for homicide in Corsica from 1880 to 1883 with those sentenced in those parts of Italy that give the highest figures, the following data are obtained. A table is displayed on the page, titled Persons Sentenced in 1880 to 1883. A main column titled Yearly Average to 100,000 Inhabitants is split between Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and Calabria, and Molise, Campobasso. Data is compared with simple homicides and assaults resulting in death, murders and highway robberies with homicide. This means that although Corsica belongs to France politically, it is Italian both in race and in the character of its crimes. Lecluse remarks, of the 2 islands, Sardinia and Corsica, once united, it is Corsica notwithstanding its political connection with France, that is by its geographical position and by its historical traditions most Italian. Thus the marked difference between the criminality of Corsica and that of Sardinia are to be explained in great measure by racial causes, and this explanation is confirmed by the great resemblance existing between the criminality of Corsica and that of Sicily. The fact is that, in Sicily, the Saracen element came to dominate all the others, and this same stock, more fierce than Corvitos, exercises a great influence in Corsica. We know that the ancient inhabitants, Ligurians and Iberians, or some think Sicilians, were followed by the Phoenicians and the Romans, but especially up to the 11th century by the Saracens, and after these by the Italians and the French. It is then to their Saracen blood that Corsica, Sicily, and in part Calabria owe their intense homicidal criminality, together with a degree of criminality as regards property. Subchapter 21. Races in France. A glance at the distribution of crimes in France shows that it is to the Ligurian and Gallic races that we owe the maximum of crimes of blood. This is proved in detail by the summary of the various crimes in the departments that furnish figures above the average. From such a summary we discover that a tendency towards murder increases as we pass from the departments having a Cimbric population, 1 out of the 18, or 5.5%, showing a number of murders above the average, to the Gallic departments, with 8 out of 32, or 25% above the average. Then to the Iberian, with 3 out of 8, or 37.5%, and Belgian, 6 out of 15, or 40%, and finally to the Ligurian departments, all of which, 100%, show more than the average number of murders. The series for rape is slightly different. First, Iberian departments, 2 out of 8, 25%. Next, Cimbric, 6 out of 18, 33%. Belgian, 6 out of 15, 40%. Gallic, 13 out of 32, 41%. And finally, as before, the Ligurian, 6 out of 9, 67%. In crimes against property, on the other hand, we see the Belgians, the most industrial of the races, lead with 67% of their departments above the average, followed closely by Ligurians and Iberians with 60% and 61% respectively, while the Cimbric and Gallic elements show only 30% and 39%. As I have shown in my Crime Politique, the dominant influence of the Ligurian and Gallic race is determined by their greater activity. The Ligurian peoples of France furnished the maximum of incidence, all the departments, or 100%, being above the average, and the maximum number of men of genius, 60% of the departments, being above the average. The Gallic departments come next, with 82% for insurgents and 90% for men of genius. The Belgians, 62% and 33%, while the Cimbric department showed only 38% for insurgents, with scarcely 5% for men of genius, and the Iberians furnished the minimum, with 14% and 5% for insurgents and men of genius respectively. Subchapter 22. Dolichocephaly and Brachycephaly. I have attempted to discover the relationship between criminality on the one hand and the cephalic index and the colour of the hair on the other, being convinced that more reliable indications of the influence of race might be obtained in this way. In studying crime in Italy in relation to the cephalic index, I have seen from the plates of Livy that in 21 provinces having a preponderance for dolichocephaly, index from 77 to 80 inclusive, the average of homicides and assaults is 31%, while the general average in Italy is 17%. In all the dolichocephalic provinces, with the exception of Lucca and Lecce, that is to say, in 19 out of 21, the proportion of homicides is above the average. The provinces where mesocephaly, index 81 to 82, dominates fall below the dolichocephalic provinces in homicide, giving an average of 25%. But where brachycephaly, index 83 to 88, is most abundant, the figure is 8%, average much below that for the country as a whole. It must be noted, however, that the dolichocephalic provinces are in the south, with the exception of Lucca, which is also an exception to the parallelism of dolichocephaly in crime. The brachycephalic provinces, with the exception of Abruzzo, are all in Upper Italy, and that the ultra-brachycephalic are to be found in the mountainous regions, which all have a smaller number of crimes of blood. As for the mesocephalic population, it is to be met in southern Italy, or in the warm parts of Upper Italy, like Leghorn and Genoa. So it must be conceded that the influence of climate enters here with that of race. In the case of theft, the difference is much smaller. Though observable, it is far less marked than in the case of homicide, as may be seen from the fact that the dolichocephalic provinces have 460 thefts to the million inhabitants, the mesocephalic 400 and the brachycephalic 360. In France, the crimes against persons gives an average of 18 to the 100,000 in the brachycephalic departments, and of 36 in the dolichocephalic, including Corsica, Colingon. But without Corsica, it gives an average of only 24, the average of the whole country ranging from 24 to 33 to the 100,000. If we follow the figures given by Ferry, we find an even smaller difference. And according to him, the crimes of blood among the dolichocephalic part of the population without Corsica amount to 13 of the 100,000 and to 19 in the brachycephalic departments. From this it is evident how much greater influence climate has upon crimes of blood than has race. For in Italy, where the though the Cephalic part of the population is collected in the south, its preponderance in crime is enormous. But in France, where it is distributed everywhere, in the south, in the north, Pas-de-Calais, Nord, Aisne, and the centre, Horton, Vienne, Charente, it furnishes no precise data, and sometimes even gives smaller figures than the Cephalic population. In the case of crimes against property, however, the difference in France is remarkable. The long heads show 44 crimes to the 100,000, and the round heads only 23. In general, there is everywhere a preponderance of crime in the districts dominated by Cephalic. In France, the long heads have furnished the greatest number of revolutionists and geniuses, and it is among the Cephalic Gauls and Ligurians that the princes and peoples have been found who offered the most resistance to conquest. This is apparently in complete opposition to the teaching of criminal anthropology, according to which criminals are nearly always ultra-Cephalic, but it is in reality of great value and is enabling us to show the better that the exaggerated Cephalic of criminals is a plain mark of degeneracy. Subchapter 23, Light and Dark Hair. In investigating the relation of the colour of the hair to criminality in France, I have found that in the departments where dark hair predominates, the figures for murder reach 12.6% or 9.2% without Corsica, while the light hair departments give only 6.3%. It is to be noted, however, that dark hair is especially abundant in hot districts: Vendée, Hérault, Var, Gers, Landes, Corsica, Beauchester-Rhône, Bessay-Alpes, Gironde, etc. The influence of climate is perhaps therefore not to be excluded. Similarly, blonde hair, except in Vaucluse, is more frequent in the departments with a northern climate: Pas-de-Calais, Nord, Ardennes, Manche, Eure-et-Loir, which has been shown a small number of crimes of blood. In Italy, the proportion of bloods in the whole of southern Italy is below the average of the kingdom, except in Benevento, where it reaches the average, in Apulia, Naples, Campania, Trapani, and eastern Sicily, where it is only a little below the average. Now in all southern Italy, crimes of blood are below the average, and the province of Benevento, they give a figure which, although rather high, 27.1%, is nevertheless below that of the neighbouring provinces. The same is true of Apulia, eastern Sicily, Syracuse, and Catania, which all show a low degree of criminality. Syracuse, 15, Catania, 28, Lecce, 10. In these provinces, the blonde colour of the hair is directly connected with the Lombard, Benevento, and Greek race of Sicily, and it is for this reason they are less criminal. I have found no connection with race, however, in the blonde oasis of Perugia, nor in the brunette oasis of Forli, in central Italy. The blonde population inhabiting the neighbourhood of the Alps is in direct connection with that of the mountains themselves, and shows, as does the latter, only a slight criminality. But the cause here is merely orographic. On the other hand, the brunette oasis of Leghorn and Lucca coincides with a criminality greater, even in crimes of blood, than that of the neighbouring parts of Tuscany, and as here the colour of the hair is accompanied by a special Cephalic without being explicable by any orographic cause, it seems to me that we have a new proof of the influence of race upon crimes of blood. In the case of crimes against property, there is no evident correspondence. For example, the province of Treviso, where the inhabitants are very blonde, gives a maximum of criminality, and Ferrara, where the population is very dark, is nearly equal to it. Subchapter 24, Jews. The influence of race upon criminality becomes plainly evident when we study the Jews and the Gypsies, though very differently manifested in the two races. The statistics of many countries show a low degree of criminality for the Jews than for their Gentile fellow citizens. This is the more remarkable, since, because of their usual occupations, they should be fairness be compared. Not with the population in general, but with the merchants and petty tradespeople, who have, as we shall see, a high record of criminality. In Bavaria, 1 Jew is sentenced for every 315 of them in the population, and 1 Catholic for every 265. In Baden, Jewish criminality was 63.3% to the Christian criminality. In Lombardy, under the rule of Austria, there was during the space of 7 years 1 Jew convicted for every 2,568 inhabitants. In Italy in 1855, there were only 7 Jews in prison, 5 men and 2 women, a proportion much smaller than that prevailing among the Catholic population. Recent investigations made by survey show that in 1869, out of a Jewish population of 17,800, there were only 8 sentenced. In Prussia, Horton has observed a slight difference in the discredit of the Jews, there being 1 Jew indicted for each 2,600, while the Christians show 1 in 2,800. This is in part confirmed by Kolb, according to whom the following were recorded. In Prussia in 1859, 1 Jew indicted for each 2,793, 1 Catholic indicted for each 2,645, 1 Protestant indicted for each 2,821. From 1862 to 1865, however, 1 Jew indicted for each 2,800, 1 Protestant indicted for each 3,800. In Bavaria, 1 Jew indicted for each 315, 1 Catholic indicted for each 265. In France from 1850 to 1860 on the average, the Jews indicted were 0.0776% of the adults. Catholics indicted were 0.0584% of the adults. Jews indicted were 0.0111% of the total population. Catholics indicted were 0.0122% of the total population. In 1854, there were 166 Jewish criminals. In 1855, 118. In 1856, 163. In 1858, 142. In 1860, 123. In 1861, 118. A slight decrease in the latter years. In Austria, however, the number of Jews convicted was 3.74% in 1872 and 4.13% in 1873, figures higher by some fractions than those for the rest of the population. The fact of a special type of Jewish criminality is more certain than a greater or less degree of criminality. Among the Jews, as among the Gypsies, the hereditary form of crime predominates, and in France they reckon whole generations of rogues and thieves among the Serfbiers, Solomons, Levies, Blums, and Cleans. Those convicted of murder are rare, and where they are found, they are captains of bands organized with rare skill, like those of Graft, Krefbier, Mayer, and de Champs. These master rogues had regular travelling agents, kept ledgers, and showed such a degree of cleverness, patience, and tenacity as made it possible for them to evade for many years the attempt to bring them to justice. Most of the Jewish criminals in France have their own special kinds of rascality, like the trick with a ring, when they pretend to have found an object of value, or the morning call, which gives them an opportunity to rob the chambers of sleepers who have forgotten to lock their doors. The Russian Jews are principally usurers, counterfeiters, and smugglers, carrying this last pursuit to the extent of smuggling women, exporting them to Turkey. Smuggling is organized among them in semi-governmental fashion. Whole towns on the border, like Virtuous, are peopled almost entirely by Jewish smugglers. Often the government has the town surrounded by a cordon of soldiers, and upon making a search finds immense stores of smuggled goods. The smuggling is carried so far as even to be an obstacle to commercial treaties with Prussia. In Prussia there were formerly great numbers of Jews convicted for forgery and for defamation, but more frequently for bankruptcy and for receiving stolen goods, crime which frequently eludes the clutches of the law. To the prevalence of this last crime among them is due to the great number of Jewish words incorporated into the thieves' slang in Germany and England, since the thief looks upon the receiver of stolen goods as a master and guide, and in consequence easily adopts his language. Every great enterprise of the famous band of Mainz was planned by a Kochener, or Jewish receiver of stolen goods. There was a time in France when nearly all the leaders of the great bands had Jewesses for concubines. Many causes formerly impelled the Jews to these crimes, as also to the unlawful gains of usury, greed for gold, discouragement, desperation, exclusion from office and from all public assistance, and the natural reaction against the persecutions of the stronger races, for which they had no other means of defence. They were often merely shuttlecocks between the armed brigands and the feudal lords, and were forced to be accomplices in order not to become victims. One need not be astonished, therefore, if their criminality appears great, and it is fair to note that from time to time, when the Jews have been permitted to enter political life, their tendency to special crime has diminished. We are forced upon us here anew the difficulty of coming to universally valid conclusions upon the basis of statistics alone. Even though the criminality of the Jews can be proved to be less than that of other races, a very different situation appears when we turn to the question of insanity, in which they have an unfortunate leadership. Here, however, it is not so much a matter of race as of intellectual work, for among the Semitic races in general, Arabs, Bedouins, insanity is very rare. Subchapter 25. Gypsies. With the Gypsies the case is quite different. They are the living example of a whole race of criminals, and have all the passions and all the vices of criminals. They have a horror, says Grellman, of anything that requires the slightest application. They will endure hunger and misery rather than submit to any continuous labour whatever. They work just enough to keep from dying of hunger. They are perjurers, and even among themselves ungrateful, and once cruel and cowardly, for which facts come the Transylvanian proverbs that 50 gypsies can be put to flight with a wet clout. Enlisted in the Australian army, they cut a sorry figure. They are revengeful to excess. One of them, to revenge himself upon his master, who had beaten him, dragged him to a cave, and sewed him up in a skin, and fed him upon the most loathsome food till he died. With the intention of plundering Lograno, they poisoned the sources of the Drave, and when they believed the inhabitants dead, invaded the district in a body, and were only frustrated through the discovery of the plot by one of the citizens. Gypsies have been known, in a fit of rage, to throw their own children at the head of their opponent like a stone from a sling. They are vain like all delinquents, but they have no fear of shame. Everything they own they spend for drink and ornaments. They may be seen barefooted, but with bright-coloured or lace-bedecked clothing, without stockings, but with yellow shoes. They have the improvidence of the savage, and that of the criminal as well. The story is told that once, when a party of them had repulsed a body of troops from a trench, they called out, "Flee, flee, for if we had any left we would kill you all." The enemy, thus informed how the matter stood, turned back and massacred them. Without morals, they are nevertheless superstitious, borrow. They would believe themselves to be damned or dishonoured if they were to eat eels or squirrels, although they devour half-putrefied carrion. They are given to orgies, love a noise, and make a great outcry in the markets. They murder in cold blood in order to rob, and were formerly suspected of cannibalism. The women are very clever at stealing and teach it to their children. They poison cattle with certain powders in order to get the credit of curing them, or perhaps to get their flesh at a low price. In Turkey they also practice prostitution. They all excel in some form of rascality, such as passing counterfeit money or selling sick horses for sound. As the name Jew with us is synonymous with the Sir, so in Spain, Gitano is synonymous with rascally cattle trader. In whatever condition the gypsy finds himself, he always maintains his passivity, does not seem to concern himself with the future, but lives from day to day, despising all forethought. Authority, laws, rules, principles, precepts, duties, these are notions and things insupportable to this strange race. To obey or to command is equally odious to them. It is a burden and a bore. They have no more conception of property than they have of duty. I have is as foreign to them as I ought. Result, consequence, foresight, the connection between past and present are all unknown to them. Colloquy believes that they have special routes, used also by refugees, thieves and smugglers, which are indicated by special marks. The Zinken of the Germans. Of these the most frequently used are the paterel, formerly a trident, but now made in the shape of a Latin cross. These signs marked along the course of the highways, or drawn with charcoal on the walls of the house, or cut in the bark of the trees, become a conventional means of saying to later brands, "This is the gypsy route." In the first paterel, the direction is indicated by letter lines, in the second by longer arm of the cross. Stopping places are marked by the mysterious swastika, which is without doubt derived from the ancient East Indian symbol, possibly the original of our cross. When they wish to leave the place where they are, wrote Pecon de Ruby in the 16th century, they set out in the opposite direction from that which they are to travel. After going half a league, retrace their steps. Like criminals and the priors from whom they are descended, they have a popular criminal literature which glorifies crime, as in the following dialogue between father and son. Father: Hola, Basil, if you are to become great, by the cross of your father you must steal. Son, and afterward, father, if I am discovered, father, then you must take to your heels, joy of your sire. Son, to the devil with your cross, father, you do not teach me well. It is to be noted that this race, so low morally and so incapable of cultural and intellectual development, a race that can never carry on any industry and which in poetry has not got beyond the poorest lyrics, has created in Hungary a marvelous musical art, a new proof of genius that, mixed with atavism, is to be found in the criminal. End of section 3.